We have a shocking new Sixers draft update with less than a month to the NBA draft. While there's been so much conversation regarding the Ace Baileys, the VJ Edgecombs, maybe we should be talking a little bit more about Trey Johnson and Khaman Maluach out of Duke. We have a report saying that they are both in play for the Sixers at the third pick. I want to break this down and introduce what I like to call smokescreen season. That is where we were at on the NBA draft and kind of sort through where this one lands on the scale of should we buy into it or should we not. Now, before I dive fully deep into it, do want to remind you guys, as always, to make sure you are hitting that subscribe button. We're going to be on top of things from start to finish this summer. It is going to be a much better season ahead for the Sixers basketball, and I think we're going to get some entertaining stuff in the process. Like I said, less than a month to the draft. The rumors are heating up, and to dive into the conversation today, we did get this report saying Khaman Maluach and Trey Johnson are reportedly in the mix to be selected at number 3 by Philadelphia. Quote, another name that is quietly gaining traction as a potential option for Philadelphia is Duke freshman Khaman Maluach. Another player in the mix, Texas guard Trey Johnson. Johnson, listed at 6'6", led the SEC in scoring at 19.9 points per game while shooting 39% from three. So both names that we were well aware of and kind of spoken a little bit about the process, more so on the side before we realized where these Sixers pick landed, before the lottery, that is, of course, and ultimately seemingly back in play here. Now, my initial thoughts on this, I do believe that there's legitimate interest between the Sixers in doing their due diligence and evaluating these prospects. I don't believe that there's any consideration to them taking them at the third pick. Now, what I do think is a legitimate possibility here is Daryl Morey could absolutely explore trying to trade down, give themselves a little bit more financial flexibility, and potentially add a player in the mix or future draft picks, and then making that type of selection. So let's talk a little bit about each of these guys before I dive deeper into kind of the financials of things in a little bit there. And do want to start initially with Trey Johnson. So as this report surfaces, and I did want to pull up the Ringer's mock draft here, this has Trey Johnson going 8th overall to the Brooklyn Nets. Once again, I do think that is notable from the trade down standpoint. If you can talk yourself into, and Trey Johnson, if that is the guy that they want, you can pick up some guys in the process. We know the Nets are fairly loaded in the draft pick side of things. They got 3 first-rounders in this draft alone. And if they do want a blue chip prospect, if they are in love with Ace Bailey for that 3rd overall pick there, I could see the frameworks of this making sense. Now, to get into the scouting report from the Ringer, 6'4" and 3/4 there, 190 pounds there. He's 19 years old, a 6'10" wingspan, which I do want to circle back to. But the full write up saying for some players, the NBA is the first time they're on a team with guys who are better than them. While Johnson showed some flashes of selfishness at Texas, he may actually be better suited for the pro environment where his plug-and-play movement shooting can be an option rather than the team's main method of scoring. Brooklyn is very much in a soul-searching phase, so it's hard to say exactly what he'll be plugging into, but they're also at a good spot on upside. Johnson will need to improve defensively to avoid being a liability, and both his finishing and ball handling will require some work before he gets into star territory. But the shooting translates. Sometimes it's as simple as that. And that is kind of the Trey Johnson story, that if you were hooper pilled, if you're a guy who's just about dudes that get buckets, that is Trey Johnson here. Now, with that being said, there is a lot to be desired with his game outside of this. The defensive stuff, I can't exaggerate how non-NBA ready he is from the defensive side of things. Now, with that being said, he has the tools to get there. That if you're 6'10" and can move around at a pretty high level like Trey Johnson does, you should be able to put things together. And to be fair to him, when there is so much on your plate from an offensive standpoint, which I think you could make a legitimate case that Trey Johnson had as much on his plate as any player in this NBA draft here, it is a little bit unfair to grade him on that scale for the defensive side of things. That does not excuse things. Frankly, some of the defensive tape that I've watched is kind of offensive to me from like the effort standpoint. I'm more willing to live with a guy that tries and can't quite get there. You know, the guys that are going to make you work for it. That's not quite Trey Johnson. Now, granted, it's a different standard when you get to the NBA, and he's going to have to adjust to that regardless of what team he's on, but did want to make that clear. Now, to jump to the Khaman Maluach conversation, this is a player that I like a lot. And by the way, not out on Trey Johnson whatsoever. Absolutely zero consideration for me with that 3rd overall pick. He's not one of my guys in this draft, but I do understand the vision. And to speak purely from the Sixers direction, I don't really see a world where it works, where Trey Johnson, Jared McCain, and Tyrese Maxey are all sharing the floor together. And when you throw Quentin Grimes in this mix, I really don't see a route where that works. So that's kind of where I stop on the Trey Johnson conversation. I do believe he's an NBA player. I do think he's very fit dependent, which I think is pretty frustrating here. Like, there's a world to me where if he gets drafted by the Charlotte Hornets, I see a world where he just kind of doesn't stick in the NBA. And I think he's probably the highest variance player in this entire early lottery mix. Now, to talk about a guy that is a more sure bet, that would be Khaman Maluach. And the Ringer mock draft has him going 6th overall to the Washington Wizards here. The write-up saying the Wizards took one of the bigger flaming arrows to the heart on lottery night, but now they're picking at number 6. They might as well lean all the way into the insane length that they already have. At just 18 years old, Maluach was easily the most dominant gravitational force in college basketball this year, drawing defenders in the post and deterring would-be finishers who entertain misguided ideas of being finishers driving to the basket. Some rim protectors are big and long, and they become deterrents simply by being on the floor, and Maluach is one of them. Concerns about his balance and narrow frame bubbled during the last stretch of Duke's season, raising questions about whether the NBA-level physicality might immobile him in a way that neutralizes his great size. But the young big guy has a lot of room to get stronger, while offenses even be able to see through the forest of limbs that Maluach, Alex Sarr, and Bilal Coulibaly will create by playing side by side. The glimpses Khaman has shown on the offense are simple, but they might be enough considering the upside and his total package. So you can see the measurements here, 7 foot. I've seen him listed as high as 7'2" there, a 7'6.8" wingspan, a 9'6" standing reach. He is just 18 years old, a guy who is very early in his basketball journey here, that he first picked up and started playing organized basketball at age 14. He's the youngest player to ever enroll in the NBA Academy over in Africa, where there's been a pretty successful feeder program. Joel Embiid is one of a clear example of a success story of a player that has come from that. He was the 3rd youngest player to ever play in FIBA, representing South Sudan. He was the youngest player to represent in the Olympics this season. A pretty impressive resume at a very, early age and early stage of his basketball career. And a way that I constantly describe his approach is inquisitive. He's still figuring things out on his own, but the skill set is there. I do believe in the touch. He shot 76% at the free throw line this year. He's, again, not a guy that I would touch at 3, but I see the vision here. Now, unfortunately, if the Sixers are showing real interest here, I do think that is probably a case that it speaks a little bit more in their belief or lack thereof in Joel Embiid's health moving forward. I do think he's a guy that could be looked at as you're never going to fully replace Joel Embiid, but he's certainly a center, Maluach there. Now, with that being said, I do think that there's fair critiques about Embiid from a rebounding perspective, and we know Embiid's ability on the perimeter that you can pair them. It's not like these guys will be mutually exclusive here, that you can't play some of them together, but that would be my takeaway. If that is the direction the Sixers are going, they don't believe that there is a bounce back for Joel Embiid. So while I believe in Maluach as a talent, I don't quite see Philadelphia as the ideal place for him, and I frankly kind of think that would be a waste of a 3rd pick, certainly from the 3rd pick. Again, I get the concept of moving down. I like him as a player, but neither one of these guys would be in my direction here. Now, why I do think is on the table for the Sixers, or why I think Daryl Morey is certainly at least exploring these options here, a lot of it does have to do with the financials. And I did want to initially pull up this little write-up from the Sixers sense here, which sort of acknowledged that they have to make a decision on it's either Quentin Grimes or Guerschon Yabusele. That's not quite true to that extent here. They're in very different spots, with Yabusele being an unrestricted free agent, Quentin Grimes being restricted, which means the Sixers have a chance to match there, and obviously just situationally very different. That Quentin Grimes has bounced around the NBA to this point, that this is his 4th NBA team. We look at Yabusele, not the case whatsoever, that he flamed out in his first chance, got a minimum contract, and this is really him sort of looking for a payday here. And the write-up states, Daryl Morey and the front office are exploring trading down in the draft. They want to have a top 10 selection, but could land some added depth and dump a couple of contracts into this trade. It doesn't sound bad until Ace Bailey becomes a top 30 player in the league, and it is all Philly fans can talk about. There are 0 guarantees, but it is a massive risk that the Sixers should be terrified to take on. Letting Yabu walk in free agency is a nightmare of its own. The Sixers do not have enough depth as constructed, so nothing for a solid role player hurts. There is no obvious solution here. The 76ers face a problematic situation no matter what Morey and the front office do. Watching a star they could have drafted blossom in another city will be soul-crushing. Seeing Yabu thrive on a contender would also hurt. The Sixers could trade other picks to dump Oubre and Drummond, but it would open the franchise to future risk. And sort of what he's acknowledging here is the reality of the salary cap situation. When you go so far down the corner of building stars or adding stars, where you have this trio of Joel Embiid, Paul George, and Tyrese Maxey, that is a lot of cap space that it requires to make that happen. There's a reason that not a lot of teams in the NBA were willing to hand Paul George a full-scale max contract in the way the Sixers did. And to be honest, I think less of that has to do with Paul George and more of that has to do with how tight these CBA restrictions are going. I think it was less about him as a player and more about the situation that it creates by bringing him. When you look at where the Sixers stand, and you can see the numbers with the first apron, the second apron here, that second apron is the really notable number that we do not want to cross from a Sixers perspective, and we're starting to see the fallout of this around the NBA. Boston Celtics sounding like they're going to have to blow up their core because it is unsustainable to have this much money committed. We're seeing plenty of examples around the league about this. The Karl Anthony Towns trade was very much financially driven there. There's a lot of this going on, and the Sixers have, to this point, done a pretty good job of avoiding it, but they are facing that barrel down. Now, to where this comes into the draft pick, as you can see the first-year salary and basically the salary cap implications that are brought on. The number one pick, a $10.47 million cap hit there, 9.371 for 2, 8.4 goes to, for that third pick, 8.4. I've also seen it listed as high as 11 there. There are a couple different numbers that do come into the mix here that does get a little bit complicated, but you can see how this scale goes from, obviously, the most expensive number being the first overall pick and where these things go down. So when you're talking about the fine margins that the Sixers are trying to walk here, there is a pretty notable gap on whether they're picking with the third pick or they're picking with the sixth pick. Just going off those numbers here, that is a full $2 million drop, and that's when you start to talk about, is there a world where we keep Gershon Yabusele and can swing this? These are all fluid. These all depend on the other options and the other offer. Frankly, there's a world to keep it on Yabusele specifically where a team just loves him. Maybe the San Antonio Spurs, who, of course, Yabusele played with Victor Wembanyama in the Olympics, and 14 France there said, I want that guy. The Spurs have more money that they can throw that direction, and not a lot the Sixers could do about it. I do think Yabusele likes Philadelphia. And I do think all things equal that he does stay if that is an equal opportunity on the table between the Sixers and what other teams are offering. But there's a world where they can pretty easily be priced out of that. So my point here being is that I don't think this is a real report about the Sixers being interested in drafting these players. And the other side that at the third pick specifically there, this is something that I do think the Sixers are opening up their options, seeing what a world would look like if they do move down in the draft. And the last point that I will note here is these smoke screens happen from all directions here. There's a world where Khaman Maluach's agent is trying to hype up his price here, get some buzz around him as a draft prospect, where he's mentioning the teams. Well, actually, Philadelphia is looking at Khaman at that third pick there. So you guys might want to make sure he's a little bit higher on your board if you're really considering him like that. So they can come from any direction, but I do think we are in full-scale smokescreen season. There's going to be a lot of reports, a lot of rumors. We're going to be sorting through them all right here on Sixers Digest, but that is my thoughts on that right there. Like Trey Johnson, like Khaman Maluach, would not be happy whatsoever if either one of them are the selection at 3. We'll see what the complete puzzle looks like as the draft continues to inch closer, but do want to hear what you guys think about that overall. Drop your thoughts on both those guys as players, what their fit would look like on the Sixers, and what is the concept of moving down appealing to you? Are you not as sold on Ace Bailey or VJ Edgecombe or whoever that selection would be in your mind that you do think this is a preferable route for the franchise to go? Drop those thoughts below. Appreciate each one of you guys tuning in this video as always. Make sure you're hitting that subscribe button if you have not just yet. Drop a like on this video. I'll be back talking to you next time. Peace.